How to be an artist. Step 36. Who am I? With guest Phillip Sevy. Phillip Sevy, welcome to How to Be an Artist.
Oh, thanks for having me on. I appreciate it.
Yeah, it's been a while since we've caught up, so I'm stoked to be able to sit down with you and compare notes on comics since last we talked. Which
Yeah,
I don't have a lot of notes to compare because I've been doing jack squat since since we last talked. But
I'm sure. I'm sure.
yeah, it'll be fun to at least pick your brain on some things. Yeah, and just catch up, I guess.
Yeah,
So
totally.
I kind of thought, I've done a couple episodes on this podcast where I've had to talk with some different people working with different publishers.
Mhm.
So, and obviously, I've my experiences with Image, and so I thought it'd be really cool to kind of hear your experience with Dark Horse. What was
Yeah,
like working with them as a publisher? How that was a little bit different. I know people that are listening; they really like those types of conversations.
yeah,
So, and yeah, I think that'd be cool, and I think that would just open up a lot of really interesting questions and other opportunities for discussion. So, I guess like the a good place to start here is, yeah, I'm interested in how kind of Triage, since that was the last thing that came out from Dark Horse that you did.
yeah.
I'm interested in kind of the generation of that project, how that came to be. So maybe you can start by telling the story of how it came to be, and we can kind of go from there.
Sure. Yeah. So Triage was a 2019 miniseries I did that I wrote and drew, and I did the colors, everything but letters. So it's a creator-owned project. So it was a little bit different than a work for hire, but that came about because of a relationship I developed with Dark Horse. Starting in my first project I did for them was 2015. When I
Hmm.
got hired to do Tomb Raider comic. And Mariko Tamaki was writing it. She had just won the Eisner for this one summer, and they were rebooting the
Oh wow,
series.
yeah.
Yeah, so I was brought on to draw the first, I think, 6 issues, and
Mm-hmm.
that morphed quickly into 24 issues, and then they ended up stopping the book after 12 issues. So it was kind of like a little bit all over the place. But I worked on Tomb Raider for them for a solid year. And then about a year later, there was a new editor on the Tomb Raider series because they did a couple mini series post our 12 issues. She reached out. Her name's Megan Walker, and Megan
Hmm.
had just kind of taken over the Tomb Raider franchise at Dark Horse, and they had a new mini series coming up that she wanted to bring me back to draw some more. So I had to come back and draw 4 more issues, and that series was called Tomb Raider Inferno that Jackson Lansing and Colin Kelly wrote. And it was a really, really fun project. It was fun to come back. I think where it stands, I've drawn 16 issues of Tomb Raider, and the artist who's drawn the most is Andy Park. And I think he's drawn
Okay.
17 and a half. So I have to draw 2 more issues of Tomb Raider in my career to hold the record for the most issues drawn. Um, but yeah, as Tomb Raider Inferno was wrapping up, Megan reached out and she said that all the like comics projects on her slate as an editor had kind of wrapped up, and Dark Horse editors will do a lot of comics and art books or other things like that because Dark Horse is a really kind of robust publishing side as it relates to video games and other things like that. So she was looking for pitches for a new series. She didn't have. She wanted to have some creator-owned books that she was editing. So that was just before San Diego Comic Con. I had a pitch for another sci-fi series that I haven't done yet, but I worked on that pitch for months and months and months. And about 3 days before the show, I was like, maybe I should come up with one other idea. And it wasn't even necessarily for Dark Horse. It was just, to have a pitch in my back pocket because I had editors at a bunch of different companies I was going to talk to about creator-owned projects. So like I just came up with a really brief concept, like a rambling paragraph of an idea, and I had, I think, 3 or 4 character designs. The 3 main leads of Triage. I don't even think I had the bad guy designed. So yeah, I just threw those together and kind of just threw it on my iPad. So when I sat down with Megan, I showed her the pitch for the much longer series. The pitch itself was like 40 pages. I had concept art. I had
Yeah.
30 pages, 40 pages of story. I had pitch all this stuff, and then I showed her Triage. And the basic concept for Triage is that our main character Evie, she teams up with alternate reality versions of herself to save the world. And one of the alternate reality versions is a superhero, and one is a like post-apocalyptic Furiosa badass, etc. And our main character is a nurse. She's a human. She doesn't have any powers. She's struggling in life, trying to just figure out her place. And then suddenly she's shown like, here's all the other things you could be in another world, and she has to kind of
Hmm.
work with them to figure out what's happening, why they're being hunted, and also like how do you define yourself? Is it by the things you can do, or is it who you are inside, and kind of overcoming those insecurities and whatnot to really tap into the true essence of who you are? And yeah, Megan really liked the pitch. She said, "Why don't you like put this together in a PDF and send it to me?" Because I didn't even have it like the pitch wasn't even written down. It was just like me talking like that. And
And you
after
had
the
like the
show,
three designs, and
three
like
designs.
here's kind
That
of
was
what the
it.
three designs would be. Yeah.
Yeah. After the show, I put that together and emailed it to her, and then within like 4 or 5 weeks, she had it approved for a 5 issue miniseries. So,
Oh, nice.
and then within the next, I think 3 or 4 weeks, I was writing the outlines and the scripts and having to figure out like what does the full story look like beyond just this concept. And yeah, that was 2018. I got approved September 4th of 2018, and I think the first issue hit the shelves that same day the next year in 2019. So
Oh, wow. Okay.
yeah,
Yeah, and you've kind of mentioned before that the kind of production on this was pretty laborious. Like
yeah,
it was a lot to take on.
it
So
was. Yeah,
yeah.
yeah. I had done a book, a one shot before Triage, kind of in between my Tomb Raider stints called Paradox, and it was a
Mm,
32 page story that I did everything on. I originally published it just kind of as a webcomic, a page a day type thing for a month, just as a fun, like creative flex, just to do something entirely different, stylistically, format wise, everything. And then I ended up kickstarting it and printing it and publishing it, self publishing it. And then about 2 years later, another publisher came and reprinted it for the direct market. But that was the first time I had done something that was published where I did everything kind of start to finish. That wasn't like a
hmm.
pitch or something I did for myself. And so that was a kind of a fun warm up to be like, how do I work on all aspects of something at the same time? But Triage, I spent like from the time I started writing the outlines to when I finished the last issue, I think it was 15 months straight of work.
Wow.
So it was 4 or 5 months of scripting and then about 2 or 3 months of production design, basically. And even after that, it designed everything I needed for about half of the first issue because there was so much stuff to design. And yeah, and then I had to get drawing the damn thing. It was going to hit the shelves at some point. I think by the time they announced the book, I was working on the second issue. Like I wanted to be so much further ahead, but that first issue took me 4 months to draw. So after that, each
Yeah.
issue was faster. By the time I hit the third issue, I felt like I was on my regular 5 week schedule. But starting something new where you're creating all the characters and designing the worlds, and there's 3 to 4 different worlds and all sorts of stuff was just, I absolutely loved it. But it was a lot of work.
And how was Dark Horse as you were kind of working through all this like pre-production stuff? Um, did you already have kind of like a firm release date, or are they kind of like, hey, just kind of let us know where you're at? And
Yeah, so for this one, once we were approved and I started putting together like my scripts and outlines and starting to like make it a little bit more solid, then we got on the schedule. So once we were on the schedule, I think was probably the beginning of 2019, and I had 9 months until the first issue came out.
hmm.
So then it was just like, all right, let's get it done. And I didn't really have deadlines per se. But I know as we got towards the fourth and fifth issue, Megan was reaching out and being like, "We really need to make sure we hit these dates so these books come out on time." But yeah, no, like they were great. Megan, who I've worked with, like I said previously on this project, and we're working on a project now together, has always been fantastic and super supportive and very helpful in her feedback and guidance, and really just kind of like trusts me in
Mm,
my creative process. Even this, I could talk a little bit about this later. I'm working on a project right now. I sent her the first 13 pages the other day, and like her
hmm.
notes essentially at this point were just like a couple lettering formats because I'm lettering this next book myself. But beyond that, she was like, everything looks fantastic. I love it. So that's for me, that's kind of nice to not have a lot of hands on, especially when it's kind of my own thing. Not that
Hmm.
I don't appreciate, like, I love feedback and guidance and help, and she gave me that along the way. But at the same time, there wasn't ever a feeling of like micromanaging or giving me notes to death. She was just kind of like, this is your thing. Like, I trust what's going on here and that you can pull it off. So, for better or for worse, the honest
And
was the way to go.
how many issues did you kind of want done when the issue one first came out? Like, what was the initial plan for that?
Yeah, I mean, I was hoping I would be, oof, if not done with the last issue, close to done with the last issue.
Oh, okay, yeah.
And I think by the time the first issue dropped, I had finished issue 3. So I was maybe an issue to an issue and a half behind where I wanted to be, but I think we still hit the last issue might have been a week late. I can't quite
Hmm.
remember at this point, but we hit relatively close to all the release dates that they set up for me.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, I grew up reading comics in the 90s, like during the Image and Top Cow era, where books would be like 2 years late. So, a week or two didn't feel too bad to me. There was no battle chasers.
Well, geez, there's a lot you're taking on with this project too, and so I mean, I kind of know the drill.
Yeah.
And writing itself can be so much work, and obviously there's like the penciling and the layouts, and
Hmm.
which is the standard stuff for an artist. But then
Yeah.
on the other end, the coloring too. Coloring is such like a huge task to take on.
It is. It is. So before Triage, kind of in between Tomb Raider, Inferno, and Triage, I did a book called The Freeze for Top Cow. And it was
Hmm.
written and created by Dan Wickline. So I wasn't writing it, but when Top Cow approached me, I said, like, can I color the book? I want to color myself for like a
Hmm.
larger project outside of like Paradox. So they said, yeah, like Top Cow is kind of the company that broke me in and who I've kind of done a lot of stuff with over the years. And they've always, again, kind of given me a lot of artistic freedom and trust, which is incredible. So yeah, that was the first, it was a 4 issue series, the first time I colored myself. And then when I came back a couple months later to do Triage, I decided, well, let me completely redo the approach in which I have to color everything. So like, it wasn't like everything I learned was thrown away, but it was like, we're going to do this entirely different. I think I colored the first page like 4 or 5 or 6 times, just different ways until I found the look that I
Oh,
wanted.
geez,
And I
just trying
wanted
to
to,
figure it out.
yeah, I wanted a
Yeah, and
super saturated, like
it's
blown
not
out.
it's not like a simplistic. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, no, I wanted something that felt like, like 90s comics on acid, like super saturated, really bright, lots of effects, lots of colors. So it took me a while to kind of find the right feeling for what I wanted in the book. So yeah.
It doesn't look, just from looking at it, it doesn't look like an easy approach to coloring either. Like there's definitely kind of a painterly look to it.
Hmm.
Um, you said that kind of more towards the end of things, you were kind of getting to like a five week schedule to get through something.
Yeah.
What sort of like efficiencies do you think you kind of discovered in the process that helped make that happen?
Yeah, yeah. So one of the things I did with Triage up to that point, the last handful of, I'm trying to think how many issues, 4, 8, at least 6, 14, last 15 issues I'd done previously of other series, I'd done entirely digital. And for
Mm,
Triage, I wanted to ink everything traditional, to have the original art and just to get a little bit slightly different feel. So when I started up issue 1, I do all my pencils digitally, but then I'll print them onto the board and ink them. And it
mhm.
had been like a year and a half or 2 years since I'd done any traditional inking. So at first it was slow to get back into that, to get the right look. And again, I reinvented my approach and style for the book. Um, so by the time I got into issue 3 and 4, like I was finally comfortable with my traditional inks again. Like I felt like I was not taking 2 and 3 times as long as it could if I was back on the computer. So that really sped up a lot as I got comfortable again. It's not like the first issue I felt was bad. It just took like twice as long to ink as it should have, just because I was, you know, getting used to the tools and wanting to make sure it looked a certain way and had a certain feel. And yeah. So those are some of the things. And then I think by the time once I kind of figured out my coloring, I'd color the whole book like in 4 to 5 days. Um, it was a real easy
Hmm.
process to just power through 5, 6 pages a day, because coloring to me works really well together in blocks. I would typically pencil and ink 1 page at a time, um, but coloring I would just take the
Hmm.
whole issue once I had it flatted and just get it all done really quick. So
Yeah, I kind of prefer to do things that way as well. Yeah, I was just gonna say I've talked to some artists that they say like, oh yeah, I will pencil a whole book or something, and then I go back and ink the whole book. And
oof.
for me, that's I like to do page by page.
Yeah,
I don't know why, but for color, yeah, for color, I like to do it like same as you. I like to do it
okay,
all at once. It's I don't know if it's just the flow of it, like
yeah,
getting to see the colors kind of flow together, because there's something specific about how the way like one page relates to the next with colors that's pretty pretty important to me, I guess. I don't know if you
yeah.
have
I
something
feel it.
similar.
Feel the exact same way. Yeah, like penciling, inking, I need to feel accomplishment, or else I'll feel like I'm getting nowhere. So completing a page is like the good job,
Yeah.
you completed a page. But yeah, with colors, there's such like a chromatic flow to stuff that it makes it easier to do it in chunks, or the whole issue or graphic novel.
But once you felt like you kind of established the look, you felt like you could kind of just like rock through it. So
Yeah. Hmm.
Yeah, so it seems like mostly it was about like you had a lot of time up front. There was just like a lot of figuring things out.
Hmm.
But once you kind of got that inertia and the momentum of like figuring stuff out, you could just like kind of work with that.
Yeah, and combination of just like, publication was looming on the horizon, so I just had to get it done.
You had to get it done. Yeah. Were there any kind of surprises that came up towards the end where you're kind of like, oh, wait a second, here's this big thing I need to figure out that I haven't figured out yet? And
Um, I think one of the things just that kind of came as I was going along, is yeah, a lot of the design stuff. Like I designed a lot of stuff up front, but I just didn't have time to design the whole thing. So I would have to be designing a lot of things on the fly. I found myself rewriting the script as I went the entire time. Like I knew where it was
hmm,
ending and I knew all my main beats, but I was like tinkering and finessing and tweaking things all the way up to the end. Um, there's a moment in I think it's the fifth issue, so it's the finale, and I'll be vague about it for those who are listening who want to read the book. But there's a reveal on who the antagonist is. And
hmm,
very early on, and for a long time, that reveal was entirely different. And it had almost
hmm,
no meaning to it because I liked the idea of like a faceless bad guy, essentially, to where there
hmm.
was no like necessary connection per se. It was just like a force of nature bad guy. It's not like, when in, Terminator 1, when you melt all the skin off Arnold Schwarzenegger, you're not like, it's, John Connor's clone or something like that. You're like, oh, it's the robot we thought all
Yeah.
along, because that force of nature is the horror in it. And that's kind of where I was at for a long time. And really early on, I had a friend of mine who works in TV and film and animation writing as well as comics. He read my script and he was like, "Nah, it should be this person right here." And I was like, "Oh, that's such a good idea, but that's so different than what I wanted." But then,
Yeah.
as the book was published, from issue one, people were speculating about who the bad guy is, and I was
Hmm.
like on podcasts and people were asking me, and I started to realize like people were very invested in figuring out the connection, like, and not just like a conceptual connection, but like who is this person related to, who's the bad guy. So I found myself, by the time I got to the fifth issue, I rewrote that reveal to
Hmm.
fit that feeling of like who's it connected to. And I think it changed kind of what I was going for, but at the same time it still was a really cool story moment, and I was totally fine with that. As I noticed the
Yeah, it was a
expectations.
surprise for sure.
Yeah, yeah, so that was a big change for me, and I really like how it worked. And a lot of people really reacted and gave me a lot of good feedback. So that was a big change at the end, but at the same time, I think it still worked really well for the story. So yeah,
Yeah, that's kind of the blessing and the curse of being the writer and the artist is like you can keep writing down to the very last moment. Like I've even actually had stuff where I'd penciled it and as I'm inking, I'm like, I'm gonna change this panel here. I mean,
yeah.
did you do very much editing on the page like that? Changing story beats on the page ever?
Um, I'm sure I did some. I can't think of any moments that were really big. I think for me, it's more so like once I get to the page and start working on it, if the clarity of the moment or the emotion of the moment isn't coming through, then I'll happily set aside what I have to rework it. And there were pages like that, I think, especially in the last issue or two, where I was like, I know what I want and I know what I wrote and I know what I sketched, but it's not working at all the way it's supposed to. So let me go back to the drawing board. And but yeah, I don't know if there was any like major reversals as I was drawing it. It was more so just refining the storytelling to hit things the way I
Yeah,
wanted it to. Yeah.
yeah, that's pretty cool. So as far as writing goes, how much of your writing happens like on the page,
Mhm.
or as you're actually like writing, and how much happens like within layouts? Like, what's the balance for you on that?
Yeah, probably more happens on the page, like as I'm writing it.
Hmm.
I had all these scripts written closely before I started drawing. Like I said, I was rewriting throughout the way, but the first, I think, three issues were fairly similar to what I had when I started drawing each issue. When
Hmm.
I wrote these scripts, because it was the first thing I ever wrote for Megan, and I was like, oh man, she's trusting me a lot that she got a whole series approved on a paragraph, and I've never written anything for her. I wrote my scripts like very standard and very structured, like page one, panel one, description, dialogue, panel two.
Okay.
Whereas
Yeah.
normally
Wow.
when I write for myself in previous small projects or things on the side, I write it a little bit more like a screenplay, where I just say like page
Hmm.
one and then dialogues and descriptions, then page two and so on. So I have flexibility to arrange it however I feel. But like this one it felt overwritten to me, but it was more so I just wanted her to be able to see what it was that I wanted to accomplish. to kind of trust, to be able to trust my writing. And some of the projects I'm working on now, I've switched back over to the much looser format because I'm working with people. She's one of them who's like, oh, we've worked together on this, and she understands how those words are going to translate to a page, so I don't have to be as detailed. But I tend to try. I want to get everything down. I want to make sure my dialogue is fairly locked, so I can write the emotions and the character acting to the dialogue instead of just like generic face, and I'll write the dialogue later. Um, but then, yeah, because just like with you, as if you're writing and drawing, I can make adjustments along the way. If I'm like, ooh, I don't like the way that dialogue is, let me rewrite it as I'm drawing the page just to make sure my characters match to what's going on.
Yeah. Yeah. That's interesting. Yeah. It's kind of, I mean, I kind of know the experience of being this, like the lone soldier, and how much work that can be. It's
Mm-hmm.
funny. I just talked to Doug Wagner last week, and he's talking about his process, and he's a writer, so he's always working with an artist. And he was just like singing the praises of like collaboration, like how collaboration is important for him as far as like staying true to what he's doing and pushing himself. And you've done a lot of projects where you've worked with writers and stuff. Did you feel like you're missing out on that a little bit in this project of having that right amount of tension? What was I mean, I don't know. Like, what are you looking for now? Or did you desire some sort of collaboration now? Or do you like kind of working on stuff yourself?
That's a really good question. With Triage and a couple other projects, that was kind of my push into like the writer artist space, like a cartoonist. And that's always
Yeah.
what I've wanted to be. That's the direction I want to go in and I want to stay in. But at the same time, when there's opportunities to work with really cool collaborators, of course I'm going to do it. Like I love collaborating with people. I love when you hit those moments of synergy between different partners. Um, so yeah, like I'm not locked into one or the other. I think it's very like opportunity specific. And working on this by
Mm.
myself, yeah, like I think I move a little bit faster when I'm working with a writer because I don't have to make all the decisions. When you're working with a writer, your job is to take their script, visualize it how they see it, and make it even better if possible. And that's a very like different skill set than the endless array of choices you can make when you're both writing and drawing something. Like the playing field's so big it can be overwhelming. Um, so yeah, I like both. I'd like to stay probably in the writer artist space a little bit more, but at the same time, like there's projects I'm talking to people to right now where it would be collaborative projects and they're really exciting and really fun. So I'm happy to set aside projects where I'm cartooning everything to focus on collaborative stuff.
Yeah. Did you find that, or do you find in this process now that you need to have someone to bounce, ideas? I don't know if that's like Megan, or if you have other people that you find are your people that you need to kind of throw your ideas against and test your things. And
Oh yeah, yeah. Having kind of a feedback group is incredible. I've got a group of comic artists and writers and editors and friends that a lot of us went to art school together, and then we've got to know each other through the industry over the years. And typically, outside of COVID years, we'll get together in the winter at a cabin somewhere for like a weekend and just basically spend the whole time throwing out the pitches or the art or the ideas or the scripts, anything we have worked on or working on currently, and just do like big group critiques and feedback sessions to kind of help us kind of rearrange and guide ourselves. So like in the beginning of 2019, I showed up and most people will have like a pitch or two, right? So 5, 10, 15 pages, depending on what it was. I showed up with 5 full scripts of Triage. I was like, there's 120 pages, guys. Thanks. And everyone read through them and gave me really great feedback and help. And yeah, I think the last time we were together, I thought it was probably 2018. Yeah, anyway, yeah, I was 19. Last time we were together, I had a spec screenplay that I had written. So again, another like chunk of pages that everyone read through, and just kind of having that group to bounce stuff off of and to get really good and really honest feedback. Because depending on who you're working with, they either don't have the time sometimes, or the skill set, or their tastes align with yours so well that they don't see some of the issues you might be missing. So to have kind of that room and that group of people to really just kind of knock you around is actually a super helpful thing that I really valued, and I think it reformed those scripts a ton before I went into production on them to have some really great, really intense feedback from 20 or 30 of my friends.
oh,
Uh,
good. And where you said you went to art school? Where did you go to school?
Yeah, so I went to the Savannah College of Art and Design, which is SCAD in Savannah,
Oh,
Georgia.
awesome.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
and I got my MFA in sequential art. I graduated in 2012, so whatever many years, 9 years ago.
Yeah. And I know you mentioned before, I think I read some stuff. I thought it was interesting that you were doing like some finance. Was the finance stuff after that or was that before that? Like what was the, um, yeah, series of events there, the order
Yes,
there?
so that was before I got my undergraduate degree in corporate finance. And I worked for Goldman Sachs for 3.5 years, just doing like financial operations. Um, and yeah, I kind of set drawing and creative stuff aside as like, a young 20-year-old because I was scared of being able to pull it off and what people would think of me and kind of those weird self pressures that I just chickened out. And then after working in
Hmm.
finance for a couple of years, I was just like, oh, I hate this so much. And if I'm not creating, I'm just going to wither and die. So I started doing stuff on like, I think I was writing scripts a lot. I eventually started doing a web comic because it was a combination of like, I can write a story and draw it and put it out there without anyone's approval. I just, put the pages together and throw it online. And that kind of led me into finding art school and getting back into comics and doing that full time now. So yeah.
So, but you initially, even before you got into finance, you like had wanted to do art. Like art was the thing where it's like, yeah, this is what I want to be doing, but but it was kind of this type of thing where like, yeah, I don't think I can really do that. Or
Yeah, no, I was like 9 years old, been a comic fan all my life, and I picked up Chris Claremont and Jim Lee's X-Men #1.
okay,
And I read it that night and I was like, this is what I'm going to do. So I was just, drawing endless characters as a kid. And as I got into my teens, I started doing portfolio samples and taking them to San Diego Comic Con and showing them around and getting feedback slash torn to pieces. And I didn't quite understand like the level of dedication and learning that it takes to do comics. I was just like, if I draw all the time, I'll be really good. I missed the whole like learning aspect of it. But yeah, I did that. I mean, I started taking portfolios, samples to Comic Con in 1999. And I would do at least that every year until 2002. Sometimes I would do samples and mail them in. I've got a handful of like really cool rejection letters with company logo letterhead they don't do anymore. Um, and yeah, like right. So I'm sure we would get into this too, but like so I grew up and for a good chunk of my life was devoutly Mormon. And so I
hmm.
served as a Mormon missionary. And right before I went on my mission, I got to have dinner with one of my favorite comic artists. It turns out a family member of mine was neighbors with this person. So they were like, oh, why don't you
uh,
come over and meet him? And he
who
was
was
just,
it?
I'm not going to say just because I'm
Okay,
going to finish this
okay,
story.
okay, sure.
um, yeah, yeah. I've not had the opportunity to meet this person again, and I'm dying to, and not to like in the throw it in his face, but to be like, here I am now, like I made it. But so he looked at my stuff, and
Yeah,
again, he was super nice, but he was also a really big artist of the '90s, where like if you weren't drawing X-Men by the time you were 18 years old, you were never going to be famous. So he looked at my
yeah.
stuff, and he was like, "Hey, how old are you?" And I was like, "Oh, I'll be 19 in a couple weeks." And he's like, I can't remember exact wording, but the nicest way he basically told me, you're too old and not good enough to make it. Um, and I was like,
Wow.
okay, okay. And he was like, if you go to art school and you dedicate like 4 to 6 hours a day practicing all this stuff, I think you might have a chance of making it. But right now, you're just like you're way way behind the curve. Um, and as someone who was getting ready to go leave on a 2-year church mission, I was like, I don't have 4 hours a day every day to like devote to this, and so like that was really rough. And so I came home after 2 years later and I was trying to draw, and when you haven't drawn for like 2 years beyond like scribble sketches, it just doesn't come right away. It turns out it takes a little bit of practice to get going again. But
Hmm.
as a 21-year-old who doesn't know his ass from a hole in the ground, like I didn't know. I was like, oh no, maybe I can't draw anymore, maybe I was not supposed to do this. So I set it aside for a couple years. But yeah, I think I kept that in mind. So when I came back to comics, I was like, oh, this is a discipline that I have to study, and these are things that I have to learn, and I have to kind of put these things into practice, and that's what ended up leading me to art school. So even though it was like a really rough conversation as an 18-year-old, and that's not the advice I would ever give anyone, I can also understand where he was coming from where his background was, and also like there was still really good advice in there that kind of helped me understand where my gaps were and how my learning style needed to be adapted to in order to get where I needed to be. And I wouldn't be here working in comics without that conversation. It just, you know, maybe derailed me for a couple of years as I was trying to figure out life.
Yeah, so, I mean, so was it kind of a blessing and a curse in some ways? Like it kind of threw you for a loop, but then lit a fire with you at the same time, or um,
Yeah, I mean, I think what it did is it gave me an insight and a look into the things that are needed beyond just that, like, well, if I draw comics, I'll eventually be really good at comics, right? Which is not true. You don't have to go to school. You don't have to take courses. You just have to understand in order to do this stuff, you need to learn and you need to study.
yeah,
And you need to, whether it's from books or comics or YouTube videos or talking to other people or online courses or in-person art school, find the avenue that fits your learning style to study this stuff. It's not just like, if you're talented, you're going to do it. Like talent is important, but at the same time, talent is not going to make you learn. It's not going to give you the knowledge you need in order to draw comics.
yeah. It's good to have those types of experience, and I think this is why like Comic Con has always been fantastic. Anytime you kind of are just like face to face with people actually doing it,
Mm-hmm.
it gives you like this really embodied sense of like, oh wow, okay, this is what it takes. You
Yeah.
know,
Mm-hmm.
it's something so weird about like even you can watch a video of someone drawing versus you watch someone drawing something in real life, and there's something that clicks seeing
Yeah.
someone in real life, or you go and it's like you're getting outside of your fantasy world and you go and you show people your stuff and people are like, here's what you got to do. You got to do that. Here's where you are. You got to be over here. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
and that stuff can be so helpful just to like get a sense. And then you have like a real sense of like, oh, okay, I know how to actually get to this place,
Yeah,
even
for
if it
sure.
is going to be, work or whatever to get there.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, something about what you've said, kind of the story of kind of being scared, I guess, and taking a diversion into finance for a little bit. That's
Mm-hmm.
something that like really resonates with me. Like I've there's been so many things where I've like not done things out of fear, but there's kind of this. It's almost like pulling back a slingshot. It's like you do something out of fear, and then the experience of like kind of running for something can be so miserable
Mm-hmm.
that it's like, okay, the fear is not as bad as whatever I'm experiencing right now is way worse than the fear.
Yeah. You're like, the worst that could happen is it doesn't work out and I'm exactly where I am.
Yeah.
So you have literally almost nothing to lose.
Was there a moment for you, like a specific moment for you, where you kind of made that decision where you're just like, I've got to do art? Like, what was that? I got to get back to
Yeah,
this.
that's a good question. I don't know if I can pinpoint a specific moment, other than just that, there was a handful of things around a certain time where I was just like, I'm so unhappy in what I'm doing, and I see time passing so fast. Like I could see myself
Yeah.
waking up 40 years from now, and I've just been unhappy my whole life at what I've done. And like, I'm not saying everyone out there has to live their dreams. I'm saying like you have to be happy with what you do. And I wasn't happy unless I was like telling a story. And I realized
Hmm.
like I this unhappiness is going to like come out in everything I do, whether it's personal interactions or relationships or at the time I didn't have kids but I do now. I was like, I don't want to be like living at work and then coming home angry every day just because I'm miserable in what I do. I want to live a life to where the time that I invest in my career is something that makes me happy, even when it's challenging and difficult. Because man, comics are way more difficult than finance. But I'm much more like satisfied in the things that I do. So yeah, it was somewhere around there after I'd been working for the company for about a year to a year and a half. And it still took another 2+ years to get to the place where I left to go to art school. But at that point, I was at least searching and trying to figure out what I needed to do to get out to work where I was
Yeah.
happy. Yeah.
Yeah. It's kind of interesting. I had kind of a similar experience where there's kind of like the decision, like, yeah, this isn't working for me. And
Mm-hmm.
then there's kind of like, okay, let's start making the plans. And it takes a
Yeah.
little time to actually get there.
Yeah, it does.
How old were you when you finally ended up going to art school then?
Let me think. So I was 27 when I started
Okay.
art school. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I mean that seems young for where I'm, my age now, but at the same time, like
Yeah.
I was 4+ years older than every other kid in my in the graduate class that I started in. Everyone was like 22 to 24. All of them were usually coming straight off BFAs. I had no prior art training whatsoever. I'd taken one drawing class when I was like 16 at a community college, and that was it. So I felt like
Mm-hmm.
very behind the curve. But at the same time, being a little bit older, having a little bit more experience, gave me a different drive and like dedication. I was like, I may not be the
Mm.
best, and I wasn't. I was about the worst in my class, but I was like, but I can probably work the hardest. And I would draw or be in
Mm.
class 12 to 15 hours a day, like 7 days a week for 2 years. I was always working. I think we went on like maybe one or
Yeah.
two little vacations during the time, but the rest of it, I was doing all that I could to get out of the art school experience what I was putting in, and I was putting in a lot of money. So
Did it help that you like knew the alternative, that you could like have that very specific vision of like, well, I know what, if I don't do this, I know where I'm going to go. Yeah.
yeah, I think it did. I think even after I graduated, and then with any type of creative career, unless you're just amazingly talented, it's going to take a while until you've got into where you want to go. So I had a couple of years where I was like, doing small or part-time comics work, trying to get into bigger jobs, and there was always the opportunity to go back to where I was, and I was just like, I can't do it. If I do that, it'll just feel like I wasted everything that I've done. So I just kept working really hard at what I've done. So
Cool. Yeah, it's interesting. As I was reading through Triage, I was just like, I was thinking a lot about like with my own work, that
mhm,
something happens where I tell a story. There's something that makes me passionate about a story, an image or something, and
mhm,
then after I'm done telling the story, I look back at it and I'm just like, oh, this is like such this just obvious story about myself. I can see how it
yep,
just like tells this story about myself that I didn't see before.
mhm.
And so I'm curious with Triage if there's something like that it like kind of revealed something about yourself as you kind of went through the process and finished it.
Oh, big time. Like anytime I write a story, if I'm going to commit myself to it, I have to emotionally connect to the story. Like it has to be
Yeah.
something very profoundly personal to me, whether the story is small and intimate or giant and crazy. Triage was kind of twofold, and one that we've already kind of been talking about was in the beginning of the book, Evie, our main character, has worked her whole life to be a nurse and to do these things, and she's finally made it to that point, and she's just not happy. And that was very similar to
Mm.
where I was at with my career, like in finance. I worked really hard. I graduated, I wouldn't say top of my class, but I think magna cum laude, so somewhere up there. Had a good GPA, like had scholarships. I got offers, not offers, but I got a job at a top investment bank, even though it wasn't like stock trading or something like that. It was still like, ooh, what a cool name to have on your resume. And I worked really hard in that job, and I did fairly well. But at the same time, it was like I've done all the things I'm supposed to, and I'm still miserable. That's kind of where I was at when I was trying to figure out, like, what do I do now? Um, so there was that element of
Yeah.
connectivity with Evie, and then the second one was, that loss of identity that she suffers with that. Like, if these
Mm.
things are how I've defined myself, and they're not fulfilling me, and or they're not important, then like, who am I in this scheme of things? And then obviously like the counterparts of
Mm.
herself being introduced into the story are like kind of exacerbate that identity crisis, and that ties very closely in to my faith transition, if you want to call it that, where I'd spent 30 some odd years of my life like
Yeah.
devoutly Mormon, not even just casual, like devoutly Mormon. And somewhere in about 2015
Yeah.
is where I transitioned out of the faith. Um, Issues came up, and I just
Mm.
couldn't reconcile those issues with kind of the principles and values that I held firm to, and I eventually left. And it was a very painful, very difficult, and very prolonged process that affected a lot of relationships in my life, and still do to this day. And this is now 6+ years later. So kind of tapping into that personal like pain and process of difficulty, and that, like, when you've defined yourself by a concept or an organization or a belief system, and you suddenly don't have that anymore, it's a complete loss of identity.
Mm.
You don't know who you are anymore. You
Yeah.
don't know what defines you. You don't know what's right, what's wrong. You don't know which way to go. There's a lot of questioning your worth as a human and as an individual. And a lot of those anxieties and feelings and pain are kind of poured into the story. in different ways, but triage is
Hmm.
very much a facet of that process that I went through over the last couple of years. And by the time I had written it, I think a lot of that stuff had gotten to a further along point. I'd processed a lot of it and I'd been able to resolve a bunch of it. But at the same time, like it's still a thing that will kind of forever affect me in one way or another. And that's very much kind of the emotional anchor that I was able to um, secure the story to, and to give me kind of that fuel for the 15 plus months I worked on it, all the way up to the end. I'm still very invested, and still to this day. It's not like I don't care anymore, but the original title of Triage, the one we pitched and the one that was approved for a long time, was called Who Am I? And we
Hmm.
ended up changing that,
Yeah.
thankfully. Just I think from SEO, you can't, like, Who Am I comic is like a Google search that will never get you what I want. But at the same time, I held on to that title for so long because to me it encapsulated what the
Yeah.
story was about perfectly. So
Triage has a lot more punch, but it's good that you
it
knew
does.
what the story was, right?
Yeah,
Yeah. Um, yeah, I mean, it's kind of funny. I've been doing this podcast for a little over a year now, and it seems like most of the people I've spoken to have been people that are still like kind of active. I mean, as far as people that do have a connection to Mormonism, most of the people I've
sure.
talked to are like active LDS.
Okay,
And so it's interesting to kind of get their perspective and just be like, what is it that the church does for you? And,
sure.
yada, yada, yada. But yeah, I think I probably ended up leaving probably about the same time as you. I was
Okay.
also devout. I
Hmm.
was into it. I was like
Yeah.
100%. But yeah, it was a very long process for me. It was probably like, when I look back at it now, it's like, oh, it's a process that started on my mission. Like
Oh,
I
okay.
can see, like, going back to my mission, there's things that I experienced, then just little by little, and finally it gets to a point where it's just like, yeah, I can't do this anymore.
Hmm.
Like, for me, it was really the thing where I decided I had to go. It was just like this feeling of like my heart's not in it. You know,
Yeah.
it's like I can't show up. I think I got some calling. I got some new calling, and I showed up for the calling. And I'm just like, why am I sitting in this meeting right now? This is
Yeah.
not my thing anymore. Um, the other thing I think is really interesting that you kind of highlight a little bit, and I'd be interested to hear your experience of this. But there's also kind of this feeling like when you kind of decide to leave, there's a little bit of this grass is greener feeling. I don't know if you felt that at all. You're like, oh, once I leave, I'm gonna have all this freedom. It's gonna be really cool, and I'm gonna be able to be my true self. And yeah, like you say, like leaving is a really, really painful process. I mean, it's obviously you got to tell all your family, and people have different reactions to that and different judgments about that. And for some people, it's a lot harder than others. Some people, their
Yeah.
families are very understanding. But yeah, what you talk about as far as like, you know, what's right and wrong now, figuring all that stuff out, the one thing that kind of came to me that you mentioned in triage is just like this idea of purpose. Like
Hmm.
she's kind of thinking about, so what's my purpose now? Like if I am not a nurse, like what is my purpose? And that really resonated with me because that's something that I've been like thinking very, very carefully right about in my life right now. And I'm kind of curious, like, what have you come to now as far as trying to resolve some of those issues for yourself, as far as like right and wrong, purpose, who you are, how you kind of like identify yourself or your sense of self.
Sure. Yeah. I think I don't know if I have a grand answer, but I can talk about some of the things that I think got me to the place where I was at, and because of that, I've realized how important they are to me.
Yeah.
So I think you talked about kind of where things started and kind of when you had a calling to, or like, why am I doing this? For me, I think kind of the thing that really pushed me in the direction I was just, I think, growing up. Obviously, growing up Mormon is typically means you're raised in a fairly conservative environment. It's not a one to
Hmm.
one, but 90% of Mormonism is very conservative. It's kind of like
Yeah.
it's this equivalent. It's hard to not be conservative and Mormon.
God bless those outliers, right?
God bless them, man. They have a rough road to go. I've had a couple friends like that. I was like, what? The first time I met a Mormon who actually stood up for gay rights, I was like, how does that work? Like, I didn't think you could do this. That's when I was a teenager. That was the first time I was a friend of mine's mom, and it was just blew me away, but in a good way. And I think that's kind of where I ended up landing is, um, you know, as I got older and grew up and kind of took responsibility for my own opinions and choices and decisions, I found myself shifting much more moderate and even into kind of a progressive space. And also just experiencing different people. I grew up in a very, a culture that was very, what's the word I'm looking for? Very homogenized. Most everyone was white.
Yep.
Most everyone was straight or straight presenting. Most everyone was conservative. Most everyone was Mormon. So everyone I interacted with, the expanse of my world was very, very, very the same. So as I got older and I got to experience different things and have new friends and meet new people, I got to view different points of view and different life experience and different stories and different pain, and that those experiences really much began to shape and change my outlook on life. And one of the things, I spent about 5 years teaching at Broadview Entertainment Arts University, which is where Doug Wagner and I first met. He was a teacher as well.
Yeah.
So
Oh,
between,
cool. Yeah.
So between working in comics and then teaching at Bo, I had a lot of exposure to members of the LGBTQ community, which I had not previously had a lot that I was aware of on like a personal level, other than, coworkers or things like that. And, in between comics and teaching, I had friends, peers, students, mentors. I mean, you can, and then as time's gone on, family and friends and other people who are members of the community. And I began to see how life was through their experiences and the things that they shared, and just to develop a better sense of empathy for the just extreme difficulties they face, especially those who are coming from or live in religious communities. And that really began to change my outlook on life, and began to make it very difficult to reconcile the things that I had believed or had been taught with the reality of life around us. And I think one of the important, values that I think I've always had, but I've definitely have tried to strive more for an adult, is just kind of the value in life, in people's lives and their experiences and who they are, and treating people with kindness, not conditionary kindness, but just genuine kindness and love, which is a challenge. And it's something I think I will always be working on. But that, I think, is where things really started to shift for me, because Mormonism is not a great bastion of acceptance and understanding, especially towards members of the queer community. Marginalized spaces, African Americans, and even women were always things. Even as a kid, I was like, why do we treat women this way? Why don't they get more opportunities? And why are they always in subservient roles? And what about our history with, African Americans and the way we've treated them? And I think once I began to really see the way the LGBTQ community was treated, that was the kind of the breaking point for me. Was I just can't reconcile or see how we can claim to, be all God's children and to be led by God, but we don't treat all of His children the same. And I live in Utah, and the impact those teachings have on the LGBTQ community, especially the youth, is dramatic and drastic. When we have suicide rates among our youth that are 3 to 4 times, national average, and the anxiety and depression and suicidality rates that are accompany, not accepting people for who they are and things like that, just very much opened my eyes and kind of rocked the world that I was living in, to be like, we can't live in such a way where we're creating spaces that people don't want to live. And that really kind of shifted me forward. So going back to how do I define my purpose and things like that? I don't know if I quite know, but all I know is the things that have always been important to me, specifically treating people with kindness, are now more important to me than they ever were before. And that's kind of the thing that I've tried to focus on and teach my kids and whatnot, is it doesn't matter who people are. We need to be kind to people. And kind is not necessarily nice, right? Because you can be nice and still be terrible to people. Kind is sitting in that space of empathy, and being, as loving and accepting as possible. So that's kind of my long roundabout way of I don't know, but this is what I'm trying to do every day, and hopefully it creates a positive impact, more so than maybe a negative impact I created previously.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think kindness is a pretty damn good place to land if you're going to land someplace. I think it's kind of this really interesting irony too, because I think I was really taught kindness through the church, you know, and it kind of sowed the seeds of its own destruction.
Yeah.
That it's teaching these some of these things so well that people like can't, you know, can't deal with the other stuff.
Yeah.
Because yeah, I think about people I grew up with, people that I knew that were so loving and so kind. But yeah, eventually, I think that's a similar issue for a lot of people. I mean, that was really one of the big issues for me was looking at like the church's stance on gay rights, like
Mhm.
Prop 8. I remember Prop 8 being one of those days where I came into church and it was the first time I was just like, yeah, the leaders are wrong on this.
Yeah.
They're wrong on this one, you know? And
Yeah.
it was the thing that really changed me was like reading personal accounts or like hearing directly from other people. I remember a friend had a gay brother, and I read like a blog post by him, and that was like a big turning point for me,
Yeah.
where I could see the degree of misery caused by this just kind of the stance of the
Mhm.
church. So, but yeah, it's also not easy making that choice to to
No,
leave, right?
no, not at all.
Yeah. Um, so let me see. Yeah, so I'm kind of interested too now about now as an artist.
Mhm.
Like, how do you think about? Do you consider that like who you are now, or is there something broader that you like to connect to as far as like who you are, or something else entirely?
Sure. I mean, you're talking about like defining myself as an artist, or what are?
Yeah,
Sorry, adjusting my
I
screen
mean,
here.
this comes from a personal place for me because I kind of had this experience a few years ago where I kind of realized like how much my identity had been tied up with being an artist
Hmm.
and kind of how much that was limiting me because I had this kind of like narrow view of what that meant, and once I kind of felt like once I let go of that, um, that I was actually able to be a better artist in some ways.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, I don't
Um,
know. I don't know if I think of myself quite in those terms because it's funny whenever people ask me what I do, I'm always like, well, I mean, like I write, but I draw and I do comics and prose and maybe some film and TV and I do concept art. And I think the way that I try or I feel comfortable defining myself as far as like it's just a storyteller because I feel
hmm,
like I that's what I've always loved to do. That's what I've always connected to. That's the way that I've been able to. I mean, I think for a majority of my life until a couple of years of hard self work therapy and stuff like that, like I was never able to open up and connect with my emotions or open up to people. I was very closed off. Be it a product of just individual thoughts and toxic masculinity culture and whatnot. Um, but stories was always the way for me to connect with emotions and with people and with differences of opinions and idea. And you put something in a movie and I'd react to it versus in my face and I would react differently. So storytelling has always been like the most important thing to me in what I do and who I am. I mean, and I think I've always used uh, those devices as a way to anything that I do. Even when I remember, teaching things in church lessons, I would always shape my lessons and talks in very story format ways. So yeah, I think that's probably how I would think of myself, were I to define that in some sort of way.
that sounds like a very like essential type of human thing to be too. If you can
Mhm.
do be a storyteller and be a kind storyteller, then
Yeah.
that's a good package. So you
Mhm.
mentioned you did some like some therapy and to kind of learning to express your emotions. Was that kind of like post church stuff mostly, or
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah?
The short of a long story is, faith transition stuff, which I said, as within probably 8 months of first like questioning here, like being able to understand what I was feeling beyond just unease.
Mm-hmm.
I decided I was done, but it still took another couple years to fully transition myself out of, that space. And in those couple of years, it was a combination of that, climate in our current world and the way I saw people treating each other and kind of the values that were championed that I felt were antithetical to who I was as a person. a lot of work burnout. There was a very year and a half there where I was way overworking myself, just trying to get things going, and just difficulties in personal relationships that came about because of church stuff, and a lot of that stuff led me to a pretty bad like kind of breakdown. And in coming out of that was like, okay,
Mm.
I'm now in my early 30s, I guess we could say at the time, and I realized so many of these things and the way that I navigate and live are just unhealthy. um, I was talking to a friend in one of Brene Brown's recent podcasts. She talks about kind of that transitionary stage where you've made it through your 20s and early 30s, and all your habits are terrible, but they were survival habits to get through whatever was happening there. And then you have to hit that point where you're like, oh,
Yeah.
shit, I got to do this better or I'm not going to live. And that's kind of where I was. And it was, quite a few year process to kind of figure out like, okay, what medications do I need for the time? And therapy and meditation and yoga and self-care and books and podcasts and talking to people and trying to process unresolved traumas and figure out healthy ways of coping and how to handle emotions and things like that. And it's still very much a work in progress. I'm still doing a lot of those things to this day and will be the rest of my life. um, but it was kind of around that time where everything really broke down, and I was like, oh, I can't do that ever again. I won't make it. And even because of that breakdown, there's still physical things about myself that have never been the same. Like I
Hmm.
can't retain things in my memory the way I used to. I used to have a great memory. Now things are just, it's Swiss cheese brain. Like there's certain trauma from just that breakdown that has manifested physically that has altered me as a person. And I was like, okay, we can't ever do that again. So we need to get healthier and we need to get better and we need to show up for ourselves in ways that I've never done before. So
Yeah, dude, it feels like a lot of parallels there, man.
hmm.
I've also feel like I've got kind of that brain thing happening. Yeah, and I kind of had a breakdown. I don't know, it's weird. My kind of breakdown was like right before I decided to leave
Right.
like work to start working on comics, but it's probably not. I bet you it's not too uncommon of a thing after people leave the church to probably have something like that happen as you're
Yeah.
trying to work things through.
Oh, big time.
Yeah, the way I've kind of felt about it is like, yeah, your whole life you develop these kind of defense mechanisms, right? Like you learn how to put on this armor, and at some point, it's just like, for me, the way it manifests, that I just stopped being able to feel anything, totally disconnected from my emotions, but also
Mm-hmm.
like I was unable to enjoy life.
Mm-hmm.
Like life was just like I didn't like food, didn't, nothing made me happy. And it's like there was still something there as far as like I still want to be a good person, yada yada yada. Um, but for me, it was I had the biggest breakthrough like doing meditation that really helped to like undo a lot of that. But the crazy thing that happens as soon as you take off that armor, it's just like you have all this stuff that's vulnerable and you
Yeah.
don't know what to do with it. You're
Yeah.
just like suddenly just being assaulted by all these like feelings and emotions, and it's like you suddenly have to learn like new skills to be able to work with all that stuff. So it's like this process. People talk about mindfulness all the time, like, oh, mindfulness is so great, yada yada yada. And it's like mindfulness is like the first step.
Mm-hmm.
Like you become aware of those emotions, and then there's all this work you got to do to like figure out what to do with those emotions and how to like work with them, and like because it can be really intense. Suddenly you're
Oh yeah.
aware of your emotions, and your emotions are like super shitty and and horrible. And
Yeah. I remember telling my therapist, I was like, I feel like I'm an exposed raw nerve right now. Like everything
yeah,
that hits me is just intense and overwhelming and it's difficult. And I mean, in the end, I'd rather be I'd rather feel something than not. But yeah, learning
yeah,
how to handle that and to process that and to deal with that is a lot of work.
yeah. So what has worked for you? You've mentioned a few things.
Mhm.
Have there been any any silver bullets, like particular therapeutic things you've done? Anything with meditation? Um,
Sure.
what has
Yeah.
been like? Wow, this has been worth the money.
Yeah. I mean, I can't recommend therapy enough. I think everyone should be in some form, whether it's, weekly, biweekly, once a month check-ins every so often. Um, it's just, that's been incredible for me. And, for everyone, it sometimes takes a while to find the right therapist who specializes in what you need and you connect with. But couldn't recommend that highly enough. I mean, I think I've been going for 2.5, maybe 3 years at this point.
Cool.
And my frequency and regularity changes depending on my needs, and I don't find any. There was a lot of like stigma I had to get over in order to call my therapist for the first time. Like I think I had his number in my wallet for a year before I could force myself to call. Just like I was on antidepressants for a while, and it took a lot of mental strength to just go to a doctor and say, hey, I need some medication, I can't regulate my brain chemistry. That was a big thing to overcome for myself, just
Hmm.
from a pride and stigma point of view. um, and so like
Sure.
I was on meds for maybe a year and a half, and I'm on some low level maintenance stuff right now. And again, I adjust things that work for you when you need it is kind of where I found what is helpful. Meditation is something I was able to finally get myself into last year, about a year ago. It took me a long time of being like,
Hmm.
this is something I should do, to finally get myself to do it. And still at that, I need to be more consistent. When life's crazy, it's hard to force yourself to carve out just 10 minutes a day is all about I do. So I think it's really just
Yeah.
prioritizing yourself, and realizing by prioritizing yourself, you're prioritizing everything else, because you can't show up and be the person you need to be for other people if you're not first giving yourself the ability to show up.
Yeah. I think that's one of the challenges we get from kind of the way we were raised is
Mhm.
you start by being taught to be selfless and you never have a chance to actually like learn to like be a mature adult before you start learning to serve,
Yeah.
you know?
Hmm.
So yeah, I definitely feel a lot of that. Yeah, the stigma is really interesting. You want to like really experience stigma. It's like tell someone you're doing like couples counseling. Like we decided to do some like relationship counseling, and when people hear that, they're just like, that's like the thing people hear. They expect to hear like right before you're saying you're getting a divorce. You
Yeah.
know, it's
Yeah.
usually like we're about to fly off the edge of a cliff. We're gonna do a last shot to do this before we fly off the cliff. But man, I had such a powerful experience, like doing relationship counseling and kind of like realizing like, wow, a relationship itself can be therapeutic. You have
Mhm.
a healthy relationship, and it's like it makes you happier and you
Yeah.
grow.
Come to find out.
And then you suddenly start looking at other relationships, and you're like, now why am I friends with some of these other people here that are making my life miserable? You know?
Yes. Very much so.
Yeah, and then how have you left now? I mean, you don't have to say anything specific, but there's usually some tension when you decide to like leave the faith. On the balance, I mean, is there still some tension in some places, or
Um, yeah, I mean, I think my family is very devout, and kind of it encompass some members of my family. It encompasses pretty much 100% of their lives, between church callings and weekly
Mhm.
participation and employment even. And I think as time's gone on, everyone's been fairly good about how our
Yeah,
relationship is, and not trying to push in ways that negatively impact that. And I've been really grateful, because you just don't know. Some of the experiences I had early on talking to people about it weren't all positive, but they were not
hmm,
as bad as some of the other people that I've heard. Um, so yeah, I don't quite know. It's a hard thing when essentially you're taught that if you are going to church, everything good in your life is a blessing. If something bad happens, it's either because you didn't do what was right, and or it is a challenge that will make you a better person. So when you leave those things, you have to redefine your understanding of the significance of things happening in your life. Something good happens
yeah,
doesn't mean it was because you were good. Something bad happens doesn't mean it because you're bad. It's life. Those are experiences that happen, and sometimes there's a result of your choice, and sometimes it's someone else's choice, and sometimes it's just life. Sometimes bad
it's
things
just life.
happen. Yeah.
Yeah. So, as you're moving on to like your the next things you're doing, what sort of we haven't covered this yet. I think we talked about this before we started recording.
Yeah.
What sort of lessons do you think you've taken with you as far as like how you're approaching like the next project, like after triage?
Yeah. So I'm working on a graphic novel with Dark Horse right now, and it'll be
Mm,
out hopefully next year. It's not been announced, so I can't speak too much to it, but I'm doing just about everything. I'm writing, penciling, inking, coloring, and lettering the book. And I think between wrapping up Triage and starting this project, there was probably about 9 or 10 months, I think, in between those two projects. And a lot of that was the COVID pandemic. A bunch of the projects I was going to be working on with two different companies got put on hold or canceled because of there was a shutdown in the industry and it pushed a lot of things back. So I spent about 7 or 8 months just working on a project that I wanted to do. And it
Hmm.
still is not with the publisher. I've drawn about 30 some odd pages. The script is nearly 600 pages long. So
Wow. Okay.
it's going to be a multi-year project. And is again another intensely personal thing to me. And it's my favorite thing that I've ever done if I ever can get it done. Um, but, after wrapping up Triage, which was such a tremendous amount of work, there was just a big period of burnout afterwards. And I expected that when I work on projects in a very like all consuming way. I know there's going to be a period of time afterwards where I just can't do it. And I think one of the things that I kind of hit burnout on was just kind of American comics. Like
Hmm.
there's so like I've read American comics since I was a kid. I absolutely love them to death, and I couldn't pick up a book for months without being like, this is garbage and throwing it down. When I knew objectively it wasn't garbage, I just wasn't emotionally connecting to anything. So in
Hmm.
that period of time, I had some friends who were just huge manga fans, and I've never been a giant manga fan. Nothing against it personally. I just couldn't find anything to connect with. And they turned me on to a couple series, and I mainly kind of honed in on Urasawa's work. So I read like Monster and Pluto.
Oh, Urasawa.
The best.
The best
Changed my
ever.
life. Oh my gosh. I haven't
Yeah.
read 20th Century Boys yet. I have them all now. They just finished re releasing them, and that's going to be my fall read. But I've
Yeah.
read just about everything else I can get my hands on. And like
Pluto's
just
my
the
favorite work of his stuff. I've read 20th
Pluto's
Century Boy,
okay.
and I think Pluto's like it's just the tightest. Yeah,
Oh,
it's amazing.
Pluto's phenomenal. Monster might be my favorite so far. I've read it twice, but it also is just like the way he tells the story, and that one is it hits all my buttons.
I
Um,
haven't read that one. I got to check that out.
oh, it's so good. It's so
Okay.
good. But yeah, like in looking at his stuff, I was just like, I love the way he combined like his character work. It's so simplistic but expressive and just nails the thing. And you can tell he doesn't labor on his characters. And there's a really nice
Hmm.
balance between his characters and these really gorgeous backgrounds. And I just love
Oh
the
yeah.
interplay you can find in his work. And I was like, I want to do that. I want to stop like slaving over every drawing because I just feel like sometimes like it wasn't what I was getting out of. So I spent probably 6 months last year every single day trying to reinvent the way I approach art, like my style, I guess you could say. I wanted a way that
Hmm.
had more expression, more energy, more cartooning, less realism, and it was like months of every day just swearing constantly because it was just not working. Um, and then somewhere along the way, like it finally clicked, and it's kind of a new look that I've been using in some of the projects I'm doing, especially some of the forthcoming
Ooh.
ones. And I have so much fun with it, and it's so much fun to have fun with what you're drawing. Instead of being concerned
Yeah.
with it looking fantastic, I'm concerned with like enjoying it and liking what I do. And it's a faster style, so it allows me to tell stories faster and get kind of that energy and satisfaction that I want out of it instead of making it feel like laborious. Um, so yeah, like kind of some of those things that I feel maybe I overworked in Triage, whether it was the way I formatted my script or how much work
Hmm.
I did on the realism or inking or textures or things like that. I enjoy them and they work great for the book, but I was so happy to be like, oh, I can do this differently. I can find different ways to approach this and make myself happier and whatnot. So yeah, kind of those lessons I've learned are in this new project, which the script was much looser, the drawing is much looser, there's a lot more energy and cartooning and just kind of enjoyment. Even though it's not a creator owned work, I'm not working from my original idea. It's a concept that was developed by someone else that I've adapted. I'm just having a ton of fun with it, and I'm very excited to move to pour that forward into future projects and hopefully get back to my giant opus sooner than later. Because yeah, I think a lot of the lessons I learned, I started pouring into that, and everything else I'm doing, I'm taking those little things and using them elsewhere. But it'll very much come out in that book whenever I get a chance to finish it.
Yeah, I was just saying, like, that's like such an exciting direction. Like hearing that you're taking that approach with the art, it just sounds like a very like it reminds me a little bit of like Mike Magnola's art. Like if you
Yeah,
follow like his like he used to do very very detailed stuff, and over time it kind of just like there's that refinement to it.
yeah,
But I think that's a really exciting period as an artist is where you can start learning to kind of like drop the baggage, I guess.
yeah,
In
yeah.
some ways, you're like, why am I carrying this thing? Like, let me just drop this stuff. More of the joy comes into it.
Mm,
And that's been like my big goal I've decided with art now is like anything I draw, like I have to find like the joy in whatever I'm doing,
Yeah.
whatever level that's coming in. So yeah, I mean, what for you like lights you on fire now as you're moving forward as an artist? Like what excites you? Where do you find that joy?
Yeah, I mean, I think it all kind of goes back to like the story that I'm telling. Um, so, I mean, it's not like it's anything that's changed per se. I'm just now finding ways to get that joy out in the things that I do instead of
Mm-hmm.
just kind of keep it inside. And I think
Mm,
it's that kind of the way it's coming out more in the lines that I'm drawing and the things that I'm writing. And I think part of that's maturity and time and getting older, and part of it's a better connection with myself that I think I
mm.
struggled with for years to have, and now I'm more comfortable with that connection, and I find it, you know, to me manifesting in ways of my work. We'll see if anyone else connects with it, but I guess as long as I'm enjoying it while I'm doing it.
Yeah, that's cool. I think healthy people, happy people make better artists. I'm
Yeah,
more interested in that type of stuff than
yeah, no,
than the really grim stuff.
yeah,
Grim stuff can be cool too. There's a certain joy to that too, I guess. But anyway, Philip, thank you so much for hanging out with me today. This has been a ton of fun.
hey
Great
man,
to
thanks for
connect.
having me. Yeah,
And we'll have to do it in real life soon. We'll have to
yeah.
brave the COVID storm and do some hanging out. You've been listening to How to Be an Artist. To support this podcast, you can go to patreon.com/H2BNA.